They arrived at the harbor expecting the usual salt and tar, but the air smelled sweet, unnaturally sweet, like fruit left to rot in the sun. Faces did not age, hands did not crack, and joints moved like they had forgotten pain. Then the first name appeared, carved deep into a mooring post, fresh and wet, though no one touched it. One by one, the Ageless vanished without struggle, leaving only names pressed into wood. The town looked perfect, eternal, but it was empty. And the harbor waited, patient, hungry, and impossible to escape. The first sign was not youth, but smell. It arrived before anyone thought to look at their faces or hands, drifting in from the water at dawn and settling over the harbor like a mistake no one could quite place. Beneath the familiar layers of tar, salt, and fish rot crept a sweetness, soft and ripe, like fruit split open and forgotten in the sun. It did not overpower the air. It blended with it, warm and faintly intimate, close enough to breathe without noticing until it was already inside the lungs. The port had always been old. Its stones were rounded by centuries of boots and tide, its wooden piers darkened by pitch and brine. Men aged quickly there. Skin cracked in winter winds, joints stiffened from hauling nets and barrels, scars thickened and whitened with time. That was how the town measured years, in bent backs, in hands that shook when lifting cups. Then those signs began to loosen their hold. Fishermen woke to find their fingers smooth where they should have split. Old burns faded to pale ghosts. Knees that had screamed through every cold morning bent without protest. No one announced it. They simply noticed, quietly, while washing their hands or pulling on boots. The sea fog arrived thicker than before, rolling in every morning as if exhaled deliberately. It clung to skin, warm and damp, beating along eyelashes and lips. Breathing it felt different, heavier, as though the air carried weight meant to be held rather than passed through. Faces emerging from it looked strangely intact, untouched by the years that should have settled into them. Time did not halt. It slipped. It slid off bodies that no longer seemed willing to hold it. Mirrors told a gentler story than memory. Men who expected to see their fathers' faces looking back found instead something closer to their own youth. Lines softened, color returned. Women who had resigned themselves to thinning hair and sagging skin saw those changes hesitate, then retreat. The town accepted this with the calm practicality that comes from living beside the sea. Storms and fortune had always arrived without explanation. This felt no different, only kinder. The harbor itself seemed to participate. The water moved with an unhurried patience, slapping softly against stone in a rhythm that felt almost measured. Nets came up lighter. Fish shone with an unusual brightness before dulling again on deck. The wooden posts along the piers stayed damp longer than they should have, surfaces dark and faintly warm even under clear skies. The smell of sweetness lingered their strongest, rising from the grain of the wood itself. No one spoke of cost because nothing had been taken yet. Work continued. Boats sailed and returned. Children grew while their parents did not, an oddity noted and set aside. The miracle was small enough to be believable, gradual enough to feel earned. The town let it settle into daily life, breathing deeply of the warm fog each morning, unaware that the harbor was not offering preservation, but preparing space. Months passed in a way that felt incomplete, as if time had begun skipping its own accounting. Seasons arrived and departed on schedule. Storms still tore sails and split crates. Winters still laid frost along the roofs, yet none of it settled into faces the way it should have. The town learned this gradually, through small dissonances that accumulated until they could no longer be dismissed. Hair kept its color. Lines halted mid-formation. Backs remained straight under loads that should have bent them by now. The body continued its labor, but the record of that labor stopped being written on flesh. Years followed, but they did not announce themselves. Birthdays became vague gestures, marked by habit rather than change. People struggled to remember how old they were meant to be, the numbers slipping free without resistance. Counting felt unnecessary when nothing seemed to answer to it. Age became something children possessed and adults recalled rather than experienced. Families began to look wrong in ways that were difficult to articulate. Children grew tall and angular beside parents whose faces stayed smooth and bright-eyed, as if assembled from mismatched parts rather than born through time. Outsiders noticed first, then stopped asking questions when the answers never satisfied. Mirrors softened the unease. Reflections offered reassurance that felt earned, deserved. A man who had expected to see his father's sagging jowls instead found his own face preserved, familiar, and intact. A woman traced the absence of new lines with careful fingers, telling herself it was the sea air, the steady work, the lack of inland sickness. The lie was gentle, and so it held. People trusted what they could see more than what they felt slipping beneath it. The port flourished. Sailors arrived for trade and stayed for curiosity, then lingered longer than planned. Rumors traveled faster than ships, speaking of dockworkers whose hands never stiffened and innkeepers whose eyes stayed sharp even after decades of pouring drink and listening to confessions. Men who intended to stay a night stayed a season. Some stayed longer, drawn by the quiet promise that whatever touched this harbor might loosen time's grip on them as well. Taverns grew crowded and loud, floors sticky with spilled ale and saltwater boots. Yet even there the smell persisted beneath smoke and sweat, that faint sweetness threading through everything. The harbor itself grew busier, but never felt strained. The water beneath the planks slapped softly against stone in a steady rhythm, patient and unhurried. It sounded less like tide and more like counting, a slow, deliberate keeping of measure that no one consciously acknowledged. At night, when the port quieted and ships creaked against their moorings, that sound carried upward through the wood and into the bones of those sleeping above it. Dreams grew heavier then, dense with sensation rather than image, bodies sinking into warmth without knowing why. Wood behaved strangely. New timbers darkened faster than expected, absorbing moisture even in dry weather. Old planks stayed damp, their grains swelling subtly, edges rounding as if handled constantly by unseen hands. The posts along the piers felt warm to the touch at dawn, retaining heat long after the fog burned away inland. Tar softened too easily, leaving black smears on palms and clothes that smelled faintly sweet beneath the pitch. Carpenters noticed their tools dulling faster, metal scraping against wood that resisted cutting in a way that felt wrong. The town adjusted its routines without discussion. People slept longer. Meals stretched. Work was done thoroughly but without urgency, as if the pressure to hurry had dissolved along with wrinkles and aches. Fatigue still came, but it passed cleanly, leaving no lasting mark. Injuries healed with unsettling speed. A crushed finger swelled, bruised, then returned to usefulness without the expected stiffness. Cuts closed neatly, scars fading before they could thicken. Pain lost its authority, becoming an inconvenience rather than a warning. Children noticed the difference in their parents long before they understood it. They grew up measuring themselves against bodies that did not change, learning that growth was something one-sided. Adolescents passed their elders in height, voice deepening while faces above them stayed smooth and unchanged. This created a quiet imbalance, a sense that maturity no longer aligned with authority. Respect became habitual rather than earned through visible age. Some children found it comforting. Others found it deeply unsettling, sensing that the future no longer pointed forward in a straight line. Visitors came to test the rumors. Some arrived sick or worn thin by years at sea, hoping for relief. They stayed, breathing deeply of the fog each morning, watching their own aches loosen. Those who stayed longest began to resemble the town's natives, faces settling into the same preserved state. Few chose to leave once they noticed the change. The road inland felt colder, harsher, full of consequences they no longer wished to accept. Yet beneath the comfort, something tightened. The sweetness in the air grew more pronounced along the docks, clinging to clothes and hair. It lingered on the tongue after long days near the water, metallic and ripe at once. The sound beneath the planks grew easier to notice when one listened for it, a soft, repetitive motion that never hurried and never stopped. At night, some woke with a sensation of lightness in the chest, as if part of their weight had been set aside temporarily. Names began to feel important in ways no one articulated. People repeated them more often than necessary, signing ledgers carefully, carving initials into crates and beams. The act felt grounding, reassuring, as if anchoring something that threatened to drift. No one questioned why the wood accepted these marks so readily, fibers parting cleanly beneath knives and nails, edges darkening almost immediately. The port thrived outwardly, ships lining the harbor, laughter spilling from taverns, faces glowing with health that bordered on excess. Yet time continued to pass elsewhere. News arrived of wars fought and ended, of rulers aged and buried. Those stories felt distant, unreal, belonging to a world that still obeyed older rules. Here, the harbor held steady, suspended in a long, unmarked present. Beneath the planks, the water continued its patient work. It slapped against stone with the same measured insistence, counting something that had nothing to do with years. The town heard it without listening, breathed sweetness without tasting danger, and mistook the absence of decay for safety. What it did not yet understand was that preservation was not the same as protection, and that anything held too long eventually needed somewhere else to go. The first name appeared after a storm that rearranged nothing and damaged no ships, a storm remembered only for how briefly it touched the harbor before retreating. Rain fell hard and warm, driving people indoors, and when morning came the docks steamed gently under pale light. That was when the mark was seen, cut deep into a mooring post near the outer pier. The letters were dark and wet despite the dry air, their edges swollen as if the wood itself had been wounded and had not yet decided how to heal. Sap clung to the grooves, sticky and red-tinged, carrying the sharp scent of iron beneath sweetness. No one claimed responsibility. The name belonged to a man everyone recognized, a dock worker whose face had not changed in longer than anyone could comfortably remember. He stood nearby when it was noticed, his hands empty, his palms clean. The cut itself told a different story. Whoever shaped it had pressed hard, not hurried or careless. Each curve was rounded with attention, the strokes confident and deliberate, as if the hand had known exactly how much pressure the wood would accept. There were no splinters, no ragged tears. The post had opened for the blade willingly. The town treated it as a curiosity at first. Knives were common tools, names were carved into wood for many reasons. Yet something about the freshness unsettled those who lingered near it. The surface around the letters felt warm to the touch long after the sun rose, and the smell did not fade. It thickened instead, sap seeping slowly, gathering in the grooves overnight and darkening by morning. The name looked newer with each passing day, swelling slightly, edges smoothing as if the wood were adjusting itself around the mark. Then another appeared. This one cut into the side of a warehouse beam, higher up, requiring either a ladder or unusual reach. It belonged to a woman who ran one of the busiest inns along the harbor road, her hair still dark, her eyes still sharp despite the decades she claimed to remember. The letters were deeper than the first, pressed so firmly that the grain bowed inward around them. Again, no one admitted to carving it. Again, the wood bled sap and held warmth. The smell followed, faint but unmistakable. Soon the docks carried more than rope scars and nail holes. Names began to surface along posts, beams, crates, even along the ribs of ships pulled in for repair. They were never random. Each belonged to someone who had remained unchanged while seasons passed over the town. Sailors who had stayed too long found their own names appearing among them, carved into wood they swore they had never touched. Those who aged normally, whose faces still answered to time, were never marked. The pattern became impossible to ignore. The older the body remained, the fresher the carving looked. Names belonging to those preserved longest appeared swollen and dark, sap beating along the grooves as if freshly cut. Newer names looked drier by comparison, still sharp-edged, still settling. The harbor began to smell different. The sweetness intensified near the markings, layered with the metallic tang that clung to the back of the throat. People found themselves breathing shallowly near the docks without understanding why. Attempts were made to remove the names. A carpenter planed one smooth, shaving the surface down until the letters vanished. By morning, the wood had split along the grain, cracking open to reveal the same name again, deeper this time, the letters broader and more confident. Another was burned away with pitch and flame, leaving blackened wood that smoked long after the fire died. The next day, the name emerged through the char, pale and wet, sap oozing through soot. The harbor learned quickly that erasure was not an option the wood recognized. People began avoiding the marked areas without discussion. Routes shifted. Work was done at arm's length. Touching the names left residue on the skin, a faint stickiness that smelled of sap and rust and lingered even after washing. Some reported a tingling beneath the skin afterward, a sense of pressure along the fingers and palms, as if something had been briefly pressed inward. At night, the harbor changed character. The fog thickened around the docks, rolling low and heavy, trapping the smell close to the ground. The names seemed darker then, absorbing what little light the lanterns offered. Some claimed the grooves looked deeper by morning, as though the letters had settled further into the wood while no one watched. Others noticed that the sound beneath the planks had changed, the patient slap of water against stone growing slightly more pronounced near the markings, its rhythm unbroken but somehow more attentive. Those whose names appeared first reacted with confusion rather than fear. They continued their routines, unwilling to connect the carving to themselves beyond coincidence. Yet something subtle shifted in them. They lingered near the docks longer than necessary, hands resting on posts without conscious decision. They touched their names more often than expected, fingers tracing the grooves, following the curves with a familiarity that bordered on recognition. The wood beneath their hands felt warm, almost yielding, as if shaped by memory rather than grain. The town tried to rationalize. Pranks were blamed, though no one was ever caught. Superstition crept in quietly, folded into existing beliefs about the sea and its appetites. Some suggested the harbor was marking those it favored. Others whispered that it was keeping account. These theories were spoken carefully, never near the docks, as if the wood itself might listen. Ships began to resist departure. Vessels marked with names developed problems that defied easy repair. Planks warped inward. Keels groaned under calm seas. Ropes frayed too quickly, fibers stiffening and darkening as if soaked in sap rather than salt water. Captains delayed, then postponed, then abandoned plans entirely. The harbor did not force them to stay. It made leaving feel impractical, unnecessary, faintly wrong. The names multiplied until they became part of the landscape. Visitors noticed them immediately, asking questions the town no longer answered directly. Guides changed routes. Dockworkers learned where not to look. Yet the markings continued to appear in new places, always finding fresh wood, always choosing familiar identities. The harbor had become a ledger written in grain and sap, recording something other than years. Those unmarked began to feel a different kind of unease. They aged normally, felt the usual aches and fatigue, and in doing so grew increasingly distinct from those preserved around them. They sensed a quiet sorting taking place, a division not announced but enforced through attention. Some left early, following inland roads with a haste that felt instinctive. Others stayed, drawn by work or comfort or the simple weight of habit, telling themselves that names were only names, that wood was only wood. The storm that had brought the first carving faded from memory, but its effect remained etched across the harbor. The town had crossed an invisible threshold without noticing, moving from preservation into inscription. Time no longer passed over bodies, but it did not disappear. It was being redirected, pressed into wood, into something that could hold it without complaint. The docks bore the weight of this exchange quietly, their posts swelling, their beams darkening, their surfaces warm and alive beneath the hands of those who did not yet understand that they were being remembered in advance. Disappearances followed without struggle, arriving with the same quiet inevitability as fog. They did not announce themselves with panic or interruption. A man would leave his house in the morning, boots clean, coat buttoned, and never reach the pier where he had worked for decades. A woman would set bread to rise near the hearth, step outside to shake crumbs from a cloth, and fail to return inside. Doors were left ajar. Fires burned down to ash unattended. The town learned of each absence not through noise, but through the shape left behind, a space where routine should have continued and did not. There were no signs of violence, no overturned furniture, no drag marks in dirt or snow. The wind carried nothing unusual, no cries, no struggle. Even animals seemed unconcerned, stepping around abandoned tools and open thresholds with mild curiosity. The absence felt clean, almost respectful, as if whoever or whatever took them had done so without haste or force. This made the loss harder to grasp. There was nothing to argue with, nothing to chase. The harbor, however, responded immediately. Each disappearance was followed by new names. They appeared etched into wood, stone, and eventually metal, the cuts deep and confident, never tentative. Mooring posts filled first, their surfaces layered with letters that overlapped and intertwined. Warehouse beams followed, then the ribs of ships pulled in for repair. Even hulls freshly tarred split open to reveal names pressed through pitch and plank alike. Vessels marked this way refused to sail afterward, their timbers groaning under calm seas, their rudders stiff, as if the harbor itself had closed a hand around them. The fog thickened in response, rolling in earlier each day and lingering longer. It pressed warm and damp against the lungs, making breathing feel deliberate rather than automatic. Those who spent long hours near the water noticed a strange lightness settling into their bodies. Weight shifted oddly. Steps felt less grounded. The sensation was not unpleasant. It felt like relief, like setting down a burden carried too long without realizing it. People rested more often without feeling tired, sitting where they stood, gazes drifting toward the water without focus. The town attempted accounting. Lists were made, names spoken carefully, checked against homes and work schedules. These efforts dissolved quickly. Names repeated themselves strangely in memory, slipping free when written down, blurring when recalled. The harbor kept better record than any ledger. For every person gone, their name appeared somewhere new, cut deeper than the last, sap or rust bleeding briefly before settling. The wood around these carvings swelled and darkened, grain bending inward, as if accommodating something beneath the surface. Those left behind searched briefly, more out of habit than hope. Paths were walked. Shorelines were scanned. Nets were pulled and empty and examined closely. Nothing was found. No bodies washed ashore. The sea offered no answers and did not pretend to. It moved as it always had, patient and rhythmic, slapping softly against stone beneath the planks, counting without pause. Fear entered the town quietly, disguising itself as practicality. People began locking doors at night, though there was no evidence that locks mattered. They avoided the fog when possible, though it crept inland regardless. Children were kept close, then gradually restricted from the harbor altogether. Even so, the disappearances did not follow pattern. They did not favor the careless or the bold. They took those who had remained unchanged longest, those whose faces still refused time. Youth became suspect. Preservation began to feel like a delay rather than protection. Those marked with names reacted differently once disappearances began. Some withdrew, staying indoors, touching wood only when necessary. Others grew restless, drawn back to the docks despite themselves. They lingered near their carved names, fingers tracing grooves that now felt familiar, almost necessary. The wood beneath their touch seemed to respond, warming, softening slightly, grains shifting under pressure like muscle under skin. Being near their name eased the strange lightness in their bodies, anchoring them briefly. The town noticed that disappearances followed proximity. Those who spent the most time near the marked areas were the ones who vanished next. This knowledge did not change behavior as much as expected. Work still needed doing. Ships still needed unloading. The harbor was the town's center, and moving away from it felt like abandonment rather than safety. People compromised, limiting time but never fully withdrawing, telling themselves that moderation would be enough. Stone did not resist any better than wood. Names appeared carved into the harbor walls, letters pressed into rock as if it were damp clay rather than ancient masonry. The cuts were smooth, edges rounded, surfaces warm to the touch. Tools left near these markings dulled quickly, metal losing its bite as if worn down by something denser than stone. Attempts to chip the letters away resulted in cracks spreading outward, fractures tracing shapes that mirrored the names themselves. The smell grew stronger. Sweetness thickened the air near the docks, cloying now, layered with iron and something older that resisted identification. It settled into clothing and hair, followed people home, lingered in rooms far from the water. Even inland, breath sometimes caught with the sensation of damp warmth pressing inward. Sleep became heavy, dreams shallow and indistinct, filled with movement rather than image. Many woke with sore chests and the faint impression of having been held in place. Those who vanished were spoken of less as time passed, not out of cruelty, but because speaking their names felt different after the carvings appeared. Saying a name aloud carried weight, a slight pressure in the throat, as if the sound were being pulled downward even as it left the mouth. Some avoided speaking names altogether, using gestures or titles instead. This brought little comfort. The harbor did not require spoken offerings. It had learned to collect without them. Eventually, people noticed that the disappearances were not sudden departures, but transitions. The night before someone vanished, their name often appeared fresher than ever, sap or rust still wet, the grooves deeper, the wood around them visibly strained. Those individuals slept deeply that night, harder to wake, breathing slow and shallow. In the morning, they were simply gone, leaving behind clothes, tools, unfinished tasks. The harbor accepted them without spectacle, adding their name to its growing surface. By then, the docks were crowded not with people, but with inscriptions. Names layered upon names until the original wood was barely visible beneath them. The harbor had become a surface for memory, a place where bodies were no longer required to remain present. The fog rolled in thick and warm, and those who breathed it longest felt lighter still, as if parts of them were already being set aside. The town stood at the edge of understanding without crossing it. Preservation had given way to replacement. The harbor was no longer keeping people young. It was making room for something else, something that preferred names to flesh and found what a more reliable vessel. Those who remained sensed this dimly, felt it in their bones and breath, yet continued to live beside the water, because leaving meant admitting that what was happening was real, and staying still felt easier than carrying that knowledge inland. The attempt to leave began quietly, as most things in the town now did, with preparation rather than declaration. Ships were provisioned carefully, barrels sealed, sails inspected for weaknesses that had not existed the day before. Crews moved with a restrained urgency, avoiding the marked posts and beams when possible, eyes fixed on tasks that promised distance. The harbor watched without resistance at first, water calm, fog thin enough to suggest cooperation. It allowed hope to form just long enough to be felt. The first hull split before it ever reached open water. The sound was not sharp but internal, a dull, spreading crack that traveled along the ribs beneath the deck. Crew members froze as letters forced themselves through the grain, dark and wet, swelling outward as if pushed from within. Names emerged along the keel in slow sequence, each curve pressing wood aside without splintering it. The smell rose immediately, sweetness thick and intimate, layered with iron and rot. The ship shuddered once, then settled, refusing forward motion as if anchored by something heavier than chain. Others tried after that, convinced the failure had been isolated. They pushed off at different tides, at different hours, using vessels that had never been marked. It did not matter. The sea rejected them all with the same dull finality. Waves slapped hulls back toward shore, not violently, but persistently, each push measured and unarguable. Rudders stiffened, oars dragged as if the water had thickened around them. Even when sails caught wind, the ships turned themselves subtly, aligning back toward the harbor mouth like iron filings responding to a field. Those watching from the docks felt the shift thin, a tightening beneath the ribs, a cold clarity that cut through the fog. Youth was not a gift. It was a delay. The harbor had not preserved bodies out of kindness. It had held them in place, allowing something unseen to develop fully. People thought of fruit left too long on the branch, skin perfect while flesh softened beneath. The realization did not arrive all at once. It seeped in, heavy and undeniable. The smell changed character. What had once been faintly pleasant grew cloying, sweetness pressing hard against the senses, rot hiding beneath it like a second breath. It settled into hair and fabric, into food and water. The fog thickened and no longer lifted fully even at noon, hanging low and warm, muting sound and dulling distance. Sunlight filtered through it weakly, staining everything the color of old bone. Panic did not follow. What came instead was exhaustion. The effort of fear felt pointless in a place where resistance no longer functioned as expected. People stopped packing. Crates were left half-filled. Sails were folded and stacked away with care that bordered on reverence. Attention turned inward, to houses and rooms and the small arrangements of daily life that still responded to intention. If the harbor would not release them, they would at least choose how to remain. The marked ships became impossible to ignore. Names layered over names along their sides, wood darkened and swollen, seemed sealed by pressure rather than pitch. They felt warm when touched, even in cold rain. Some reported a faint vibration beneath the planks, a low internal hum that echoed the sound beneath the docks. Sleeping near these vessels brought heavy dreams and shallow breath, bodies adjusting to a rhythm not their own. Those whose names had not yet appeared watched carefully, measuring themselves against those already inscribed. Age returned to their faces slowly now, lines forming as they should have years earlier. Their joints ached. Their scars thickened. This brought relief mixed with terror. Aging felt like a reprieve, proof of continued separation from the harbor's attention. Some deliberately avoided the fog, staying indoors, sealing windows, breathing stale air rather than risk the sweetness. It helped, but not completely. The harbor had learned patience. The town thinned further, not through departure, but through absorption. Disappearances continued, quieter now, almost expected. Each was followed by a fresh emergence of names, deeper and more confident than before. Wood and stone alike bore them willingly. Even iron fittings warped, surfaces buckling just enough to allow letters to surface, rust blooming immediately around the grooves. The harbor no longer distinguished between materials. It marked whatever remained. Attempts were made to destroy the ships entirely. Fires were set along the piers, flames fed with tar and oil. Smoke rose thick and black, carrying the sweetness upward until it coated the throat. Wood burned reluctantly, flames guttering and crawling rather than consuming. When the fires died, the ships remained, charred but intact, names pale and wet against blackened surfaces. The harbor accepted the offering without change. People began to understand the shape of what was happening, even if they could not articulate it fully. Bodies had been useful once, containers that could move and work in age. Now they were unnecessary. Names were lighter. Names did not decay. Names could be pressed into wood and stone and held indefinitely. The harbor had found a more efficient medium. Those who stayed longest near the water felt the transition beginning within themselves. Weight shifted again, this time unevenly. Hands felt hollow. Steps made less sound. Reflections grew subtly wrong, faces intact but depth missing, as if something behind the skin had thinned. Breathing required conscious effort near the docks, lungs working against the warm pressure of the fog. Some welcomed it, sitting at the edge of the harbor for hours, letting the sensation pass through them, surrendering gradually. The town ceased to function as a place of commerce. Trade dried up. Travelers turned away at the first breath of sweetness, instincts recoiling before reason could intervene. Those who arrived by mistake left quickly, unsettled by the sight of ships that would not sail and docks heavy with names. Maps would later mark the harbor only faintly, a coastal indentation without notation, as if the land itself wished to forget. Inside the remaining houses, life contracted. Meals were simple. Speech grew sparse. People avoided saying names aloud, not out of superstition, but because the words felt heavy in the mouth, tugged downward as if already claimed. Silence felt safer, lighter. Nights were long and thick, fog pressing against walls, seeping through cracks no matter how carefully they were sealed. By the time the final attempts to leave were abandoned, the understanding had settled fully. The harbor was not a place to escape from. It was a place to be converted. Youth had been the first stage, softening bodies, loosening their grip on time. Preservation had been preparation. Now the waiting was nearly over. The sea remained calm through it all, waves moving with the same measured patience, slapping hulls back toward shore whenever they dared test the boundary. It did not rage. It did not threaten. It enforced. The harbor held what it had gathered, fog curling inward like breath drawn deep and held. Those who still aged watched themselves carefully, clinging to every new line and ache as proof of continued belonging to the world beyond the docks. They understood now that decay was not failure but resistance. To rot was to remain flesh. To change was to stay human a little longer. The sweetness lingered, thick and unavoidable. Beneath it, rot waited, no longer hidden. The fog pressed low and warm, and at noon the light could no longer fully reach the water. The town stood suspended between leaving and being left behind, finally aware that the harbor had never intended to keep them young forever. It had only needed them to stay long enough to be ready. In the end, no one vanished with a shout or struggle. The last remaining citizens felt themselves thinning over weeks, edges of bodies softening as if the air had grown liquid, memories loosening their hold like sand slipping through fingers. Joints moved with perfect ease, skin stayed smooth, yet substance drained away, leaving hollow forms buoyant and strange beneath the fog as weight. Limbs grew lighter, carrying no resistance, and the body no longer pressed against the world with insistence. Morning came as always, but the harbor held no figures moving along the docks. Doors swung open and shut with the tide, barrels rolled themselves slightly in place, and nets sagged gently, their ropes weighted with memory. The fog remained thick, warm against stone and timber, carrying the sweet metallic smell that had become so familiar, curling into the harbor's corners and pressing into the cracks where human weight once had been. Every post, beam, and plank bore names now layered upon names, deeper than before, letters swelling with an unnatural vigor, bleeding slightly into the wood as if it remembered the hands that had once belonged to flesh. The grain bent and twisted to accommodate them. The harbor itself reshaped subtly, edges softened, planks thickened, beams bowed under the invisible pull of memory. Where once boats had floated freely, hulls now pressed low, burdened with letters, grooves that carried the last resonance of those who had lingered too long, or perhaps just long enough. The names were perfect, precise, intimate in ways the original hands could not have imagined. Travelers arriving by morning mist would marvel at the ageless beauty of the town, unaware that it had not preserved its people, but replaced them, honoring the body's youth in the permanence of wood. The fog carried a new quality now, heavier, warmer, almost sentient, curling around the posts and spilling into warehouses as if it had waited all this time for the final act. It pressed against the senses, wrapping around thought, slowing comprehension, making the world beyond the harbor feel distant, unreal. Birds no longer circled above freely. Their wings brushed edges of air in cautious hesitation, and even the dogs that had once whined and pulled against leashes were gone. The sound of living was muted, as if the town had been drained of its urgency, and only the low hum of wood under pressure remained. Footsteps no longer left echoes. Nets settling in the water whispered only to themselves. The harbor had learned to collect without sound, to absorb without struggle, to replace the living with something quieter, more obedient. The last people felt themselves slipping further, their own bodies responding to a pressure that was neither wind nor water, a gentle insistence that grew with each day. They moved with care, hands brushing surfaces that had grown warm beneath touch, recognizing faint impressions of the carvings that now mirrored their own presence. Sleep became long and unbroken, dreams thick with texture, yet without image, a sensation of being pressed and folded rather than seeing or hearing. When they awoke, the fog lay heavier, pressing lightly against their chests, and the harbor itself seemed to inhale in unison. Even breathing became a negotiation, lungs resisting or yielding to the harbor's rhythm. There was no fear left, only the comprehension that they had been absorbed quietly, willingly or not, into something permanent. Names accumulated faster than any human could have maintained. Each layer pressed down upon the last, letters softened, polished, aligned, as if the harbor knew how to remember better than the mind. The planks of the docks grew slightly warm. The beams beneath warehouses shifted to accommodate unseen weight. The hulls of moored ships bent and stretched under invisible pressure. Where once children had played, the air was still, the sense of presence thick and unbroken, but flesh no longer moved. What remained was memory made material, youth made permanent in the ribs of ships, in the grain of posts, in the veins of timber that had once groaned under bodies but now carried only names. Travelers arriving in the mist spoke of perfection. The town appeared alive, vibrant, as if untouched by decay or age. Roofs were straight, walls sturdy, the harbor clean and fragrant. Only the absence of people betrayed the truth, though few noticed. Shadows moved oddly in the fog, stretching too long and flattening too smoothly. Echoes of hands that once had touched posts now resting somewhere in the wood itself. The smell of sweet iron and sap lingered, carrying the memory of bodies that had once pressed against the world, now replaced by permanence. Every plank was a ledger, every beam a record, every hull a testament to the town's final transformation. The harbor became a library of youth, each name layered meticulously, more legible than memory ever had been. Touching the wood carried weight, sensation of pressure without mass, intimacy without risk. Those who had thinned entirely into absence lingered in consciousness, a faint pull behind the ribcage, an internal vibration felt in step and breath, as if the harbor had taught itself to hold what the body could not. Time no longer affected the town. The fog, the wood, the water, they were the new vessels of chronology, recording not hours or years, but moments suspended, moments preserved. Even wind carried the pattern of names, rustling planks and shaking sails gently, whispering syllables that would never fully leave. Eventually, the final edges blurred completely. Those who remained felt their own substance dissolve into memory, a sensation of buoyancy rather than loss, leaving only the sense of being accounted for. Hands slid over carved letters without resistance. Faces reflected in still water, smooth and undisturbed, were recognizably human yet impossibly hollow, the exact echo of presence without flesh. When they moved, the air held them lightly, the harbor itself adjusting to the absence of weight, carrying what was left. There was no panic, no sorrow, only the recognition that what had been necessary had been completed. Bodies were unnecessary, names were enough. By the time the harbor received its last offerings, the fog hung permanent, the water calm and measured, and every post, beam, plank, and hull bore the entirety of the town within it. Travelers who arrived later would remark on the ageless beauty, unaware that the perfection came not from preservation but replacement. The harbor had chosen wood over flesh because wood, unlike bodies, does not run away. It holds what is given, it remembers perfectly, it waits. The town had vanished, but it was everywhere at once, embedded in grain and timber, in sap and iron, in the warm pressure of fog that never lifted. Youth remained, infinite and unbroken, and the city itself had become a ledger of the living remembered, of bodies replaced, of names eternal.